Hi everyone, and welcome to our module on bias. Bias is something that happens in epidemiology studies or clinical trials when there's some systematic error in the study and in its findings. So suppose, for example, that a study found exposure to chemical X increased headaches by 40% versus non-exposures. Let's think about some of the ways this result could be wrong. Maybe we selected or sampled the groups incorrectly, so the people that we thought were exposed weren't really exposed. Or maybe we assessed the presence or absence of headache incorrectly, so the people that we said did have a headache didn't really have a headache. So what we're going to do in the rest of this module is go through the many different forms of bias that you need to know, especially for step 1, and talk about how they influence the study results. The first type of bias we're going to discuss is called selection bias. So let's think back to our example where we're trying to study headaches among people who are exposed to chemical X. So we want the only difference between the people in the study to be whether or not they were exposed to chemical X. We don't want anything else to be different. Well, selection bias occurs when the groups differ in ways other than their exposure. So we think that the only difference between one group and another is exposure to chemical X, but there are also many other differences between the groups, and those can account for the outcome that we find. So one example is when you ask people to volunteer for a study. So imagine if you have volunteers who are exposed and you compare them with the general population that is not exposed. So for example, you send out a survey and ask people who are exposed to chemical X to volunteer for the study. Well, the people that volunteer are often different in many ways from the general population. There are things that make them want to volunteer. They may be angry they were exposed to chemical X, or their symptoms may be severe. So anytime you see the word volunteer in the question stem of a board question, you should wonder whether there may be selection bias. Sometimes this is actually called volunteer bias, and it's a form of selection bias. Another form of selection bias is when workers who are exposed to some chemical are compared with the general population. This is often done to see whether workers in a chemical plant, for example, are getting sick. But the problem is the workers may be different in many ways from the general population. And you can just use your imagination, but they may be younger or older, they may smoke more or less. There can be lots of different types of selection bias in a study like this. Usually when we say there's selection bias in a study, we're using it as a general term to say that the groups differ in some way other than exposure. One thing to keep in mind is if the groups differ specifically by one factor, for example, there are more smokers in one group than another, and this affects outcome, that's something called confounding or effect modification, which we'll talk about later. That's different from selection bias. Selection bias is more of a general term that the two groups differ in some way other than exposure. Attrition bias is a special subtype of selection bias, and this is a problem in prospective studies that follow patients for many years. Some of the patients in the groups will get lost to follow-up. You'll try to contact them 2 years or 3 years into the study and you can't reach them. And if you lose patients to follow-up unequally between the groups, this can introduce a special type of selection bias called attrition bias. And the way to remember that it's a subtype of selection bias is to think that the patients who don't follow up are selecting to be out of the trial. Or another way to think about it is the patients that do follow up are selecting to be into the trial. And that just can help you remember it's a type of selection bias. So suppose, for example, 100 smokers are lost to follow-up because they die. The study may show that smoking is less harmful than reality because it didn't include those 100 smokers who were lost to follow-up. And this is a type of attrition bias. Another type of selection bias is called sampling bias, and this is when the patients in the study or the trial are not representative of actual practice. And it means that the results of the study may not be generalizable. One example of this comes up in my area in heart failure. The average age of most patients in heart failure trials is about 65, but the average age of actual heart failure patients is usually over 80. So we sometimes wonder whether we have sampling bias in heart failure trials and whether the results apply. Now, we have to make the best use of the results we can, so we often still interpret them for the older patients, but we worry a lot about sampling bias, and this is the case anytime the patients in the study don't represent the group that you're going to interpret the study for and the group that you're going to actually practice medicine on based on the results of that study. Another rare and sort of peculiar type of selection bias is called Bergson's bias, and the key thing here is this is selection bias when you use hospitalized patients in your study, either in the treatment or control arm. Patients in the hospital tend to have more severe symptoms. That's what gets them admitted to the hospital. They also have better access to care. They have nurses and doctors around them all the time. So if you do a study and one arm has hospitalized patients and the other arm does not, the results can be altered because the group in the hospital was very different from the other patients that weren't in the hospital. Now we're going to talk about a very important and high yield type of bias called confounding. And this is when an unmeasured factor confounds the study results. So let's consider an example. Suppose we study alcoholics and it looks like they get more lung cancer than non-alcoholics. This might make us think that drinking alcohol causes lung cancer. However, it turns out that smoking is much more prevalent among alcoholics. So smoking is the true cause of more cancer, and we would call smoking a confounder of the results. It makes it look like drinking alcohol is the cause, but it is not. So to understand how we discover confounders, we need to understand something called stratified analysis. So let's look at this 2x2 table up here at the top in the middle for a study of alcoholism and lung cancer. So I've written lung cancer along the top, and these are patients who are positive for lung cancer and patients who are negative. And I've written alcoholism along the side. So the top row are patients who are positive for alcoholism, and the bottom row is patients who are negative. And I've split the patients up such that we get a relative risk for alcoholism and lung cancer of 5. So this would suggest that you are 5 times more likely to get lung cancer if you are an alcoholic compared to if you are not an alcoholic. However, down at the bottom of the screen, I have split the results up into smokers on the left and non-smokers on the right. Let's look at the smokers first. So among the smokers, lung cancer is on the top again and alcoholism is on the right, and we've got an equal distribution of positive and negative cases, and the relative risk comes out to be 1 when we look at the smokers by themselves. When we look at the non-smokers by themselves over here, we also get an even distribution of positive and negative alcoholism among cancer cases, and we also get a relative risk of 1. So a stratified analysis by smoking versus non-smoking has eliminated the effect of alcoholism on lung cancer. This means that smoking is a confounder. It completely eliminates the apparent risk of alcoholism on lung cancer. And this is called a stratified analysis, and this is how you uncover confounders. And you're often shown stratified analyses on your board exams, and you need to recognize that when the risk ratio goes away once you split it up into 2 subgroups, that means there was a confounder causing the initial results like what I showed up here on the top of the screen. It's high yield to know for your board some of the ways that researchers control or eliminate confounders, and the first way is randomization. So if you randomly assign subjects to both arms of a trial, this should ensure equal distribution of all variables in both arms. For example, in the study on the last slide, if we could have randomly assigned people to be an alcoholic or not, of course that's impossible, but if we could have done that, we would have gotten equal distribution of smokers among the alcoholic group and the non-alcoholic group, and this would have eliminated the confounders. The way you control for confounders in studies of things like alcoholism is through matching. So in the study on the last slide, we had alcoholics and non-alcoholics. So what you want to do is carefully select the control subjects, the non-alcoholic group, to match as closely as possible the study subjects. So you try to choose people with the same age, gender, and smoking status, and this makes it less likely that confounders will be present. The next type of bias is called the Hawthorne effect, and this is when study patients improve just because they are being studied. So often when patients are in a study or when providers know their patients are in a study, their behavior changes because they know they're being monitored. And this is common in studies of behavioral patterns. So for example, if physicians know their patients are being surveyed about their vaccination status, the physicians may vaccinate more often because they don't want to have the results show that they weren't doing a good job of vaccinating. Another example is patients who know they're being studied for how much they exercise. They may exercise more often. And these are both examples of the Hawthorne effect. The next type of bias is called the Pygmalion effect. This is also called the observer expectancy effect, and it's named after the Greek myth of Pygmalion, which was about a sculptor who fell in love with his own statue. And this type of bias occurs when the researcher believes in the efficacy of treatment and influences the outcome of a study. For example, if the creator of a new surgical device uses it on his own patients as part of a clinical trial, he may use it in a way or influence the outcomes of the study in a way that biases the results. So the Pygmalion effect and the Hawthorne effect are kind of similar and they can be confusing. Here's how I keep them straight. The Pygmalion effect is when a provider believes in treatment and influences the results to be positive. So it's unique to an investigator driving the positive benefits of some type of therapy. The Hawthorne effect is a more general term when subjects or investigators just behave differently because they're being studied. And you can sort of think of the Pygmalion effect as a special, unique subtype of the Hawthorne effect where the investigator is behaving differently to make the benefit of the drug greater than it would otherwise be. Next type of bias is called lead time bias, and this type is fairly easy to remember from the name. This is when screening identifies the disease earlier and it makes survival appear longer when it is not. So for example, consider if the average time from detection of a breast lump to death was 5 years, and a screening test identifies breast cancer earlier, and the time from detection using the new screening test to death is now 7 years. So it looks like the test improved survival, but it didn't. It just picked the cancer up earlier. And this is a big problem in cancer studies that identify disease very early on. Recall bias, like the name implies, is inaccurate recall of past events by study subjects, and this is very common in surveys when they ask subjects to remember things from a long time ago. Suppose, for example, we asked patients with disabled children about their lifestyle during pregnancy many years ago. They may not remember all the details, and this could bias the findings of the study. Procedure bias occurs when one group receives a procedure like surgery and another gets no procedure. You often give more care and attention to the patients who get the procedure. So if we randomly assign some patients to no surgery and others to surgery, and then the surgery patients are in the hospital and they're carefully monitored and carefully cared for, this could introduce bias to the findings of the study. It could make the surgery look more effective than it actually is.
The late look bias is a type of bias that happens in surveys or polls or other cross-sectional studies where patients with severe forms of disease do not get studied because they have died. So for example, suppose we were conducting a survey of HIV positive patients to determine their symptoms, and the survey showed that HIV patients are asymptomatic. This survey could be suffering from the late look bias because patients who have severe forms of the HIV infection would have died, and therefore they are not responding to our survey. And patients who have less severe forms of the infection are more likely to be alive and able to respond to the survey. It's called the late look bias because you are looking at patients late in the course of the disease who have survived the early phases. It's also sometimes called length bias because these types of studies are biased towards patients who have survived for longer periods of time, and they're biased against patients who die early on due to a severe form of the disease.
Observer bias is when the observers, the investigators, know the exposure status of a patient. So for example, if cardiologists are asked to interpret EKGs and they know the patients have coronary artery disease, or if pathologists review specimens but they know the patients have cancer, and you avoid observer bias by blinding. If you blind the investigators so they don't know whether the study subjects have been exposed or not, they don't know whether they have coronary disease or whether they have cancer, then you can avoid this type of bias. Measurement bias is just sloppy research technique. So for example, if blood pressure weren't measured correctly in both arms, or if the protocol weren't followed, and this is a big problem, especially if it's unequal between arms. So if one group of patients has protocol followed but the other group doesn't, then this could introduce a significant amount of measurement bias. So they like to ask you on your boards about ways to reduce or eliminate bias, so let's review those here. We talked about how randomization helps to eliminate bias. It splits potential confounders between the two groups so that they can't have an effect, and it eliminates selection bias because patients can't volunteer or select to be in one arm or another. Matching in case control studies helps a lot because it tries to eliminate confounders by matching the groups as closely as possible. If you blind the investigators and the patients, as we just discussed, then they can't alter their behavior. And then one special way to reduce bias is to do something called a crossover study. So a crossover study is when subjects are randomly assigned to a sequence of treatments. So for example, Group A might get a placebo for 8 weeks, followed by the drug for 8 weeks, and Group B might get the drug first and then the placebo first. And when you do this, the subjects can serve as their own control, and this can avoid confounding because you're using the same subject to compare to itself. One drawback of these studies is that the effect can carry over. So for example, Group B that got the drug for 8 weeks can cross over to the placebo group, but the drug effects can continue. And one way they avoid this is by having something called a washout period where they delay before starting the second phase to make sure any effects of the drug wear off. So this is a picture of the design of a crossover study. So Group 1 would get the placebo up here and then go through a washout period and then get the drug, and Group 2 would get the opposite. And so you can compare the groups of placebo to the drug just like usual here, but you can also compare the patients to themselves. And this is what helps to eliminate confounding and bias in crossover studies. What I'd like to talk about next is a very high-yield concept called effect modification. So an effect modifier is not a type of bias, and that's often a point of confusion. I'll clarify this in a minute. Effect modification is, however, something that alters the results of a study, and this occurs when a third factor alters the effect or outcome of a study. So let's consider an example. Suppose drug A is shown to increase the risk of a deep vein thrombosis. But in order to cause a DVT, drug A requires gene X. This means that gene X is an effect modifier of drug A. So the way we uncover effect modifiers in clinical studies is by doing a stratified analysis, just like I showed you previously for confounders. But the results of the stratified analysis are different for effect modifiers than confounders, and it's important that you understand the difference. So let's suppose we have our main study results up here at the top. So we've got DVT across the top here, and these are positive patients for DVT and negative. We've got drug A along the side, and these are patients who were exposed to drug A and patients who weren't. And I've distributed the numbers here such that the relative risk comes out to 5. So it appears that drug A exposed patients are 5 times more likely to have a DVT compared to patients who are not. Down at the bottom of the screen now, I've stratified the results by gene X positive over here on the left and gene X negative on the right. Among the gene X positive patients, the results come out such that the relative risk persists. There is a relative risk of 5 for DVT in patients exposed to drug A who are gene X positive. But in the gene X negative patients, the results come out such that there is no increased risk. The relative risk is 1. So by stratifying the trial results into gene X positive and negative patients, we have found a result only in one group, the gene X positive group. This means that gene X is an effect modifier of drug A on DVT.
Many board questions will require you to understand the difference between effect modification and confounding, so let's go over that now. Confounding is when a third variable distorts the effect of an exposure on an outcome. Remember when we talked about smoking and alcohol? Alcohol appeared to be associated with cancer, but it wasn't. That was a distortion caused by the confounder of smoking. This is called a positive confounder. It's a confounder that creates an association that isn't really there. There's also something called a negative confounder. A negative confounder makes it appear as if there is no association when one actually exists. But the bottom line is that confounders cause the real effect of exposure on outcome to become distorted. In contrast, in effect modification, there's a third variable that maintains the effect, but only in one group. In this situation, there is a real effect of exposure on outcome, but that real effect requires the presence of a third variable.
Let's go over this with a couple of examples. So suppose people who take drug A appear to have increased rates of lung cancer compared to people who do not. But drug A is taken only by smokers. So if we break down the data by a stratified analysis into smokers and non-smokers, there will be no relationship between drug A and cancer. Smoking is the real cause of cancer. Drug A has no effect, and this is confounding, which is a type of bias. Now suppose people who take drug A appear to have increased rates of lung cancer compared to people who do not, just like in the previous example. But in this case, suppose that drug A activates gene X to cause cancer. If we break down the data by stratified analysis into gene X positive and negative, there will be a relationship between drug A and cancer, but only in the gene X positive patients. Drug A does have an effect on cancer. This is different from confounding. But drug A requires another factor, gene X, and gene X would be called an effect modifier. So this is an example of effect modification, and this is just a technical point, but effect modification is not a point of bias, so don't get that wrong on a question. The final thing I'll discuss in this module is something called a latent period, and this occurs when disease takes a long time to develop. So if you study exposure or drugs shorter than this period, it will show no effect. So consider, for example, that aspirin is given to prevent heart attacks, but patients are studied for 1 month. We're probably not going to see any benefit. And this is due to latency. So atherosclerosis takes years to progress. So if aspirin limits the progression of that, we're not going to see it in just 1 month. And we need to study the patients for longer. And this is an example of a latent period. So we talked about a lot of different things in this module, so let me give you a summary slide to help you keep them straight. So we talked about many forms of bias here, and remember that selection bias has several subtypes, and then also remember that confounding is very high yield, and you need to know the difference between that and effect modification. Besides all the biases, we talked about effect modification and a latent period. These are not forms of bias, but these are things that can influence the outcomes of a study. And that concludes our module on bias.